Everyone tells you that honesty is the foundation of love, that how our connection is built on truth, transparency, vulnerability laid bare like an open book waiting to be read. They tell you that lies destroy everything, that deception is the poison that kills relationships before they even begin. In they he right, mostly. But yes, you what nobody tells you sometimes the most beautiful love of your life starts with the ugliest lie you've ever told. Sometimes the person who changes everything walks into your world at the exact moment he pretending to be someone he not. And sometimes, the truth that sets you free is the same truth that threatens to destroy you. What if I told you that a single kiss, accidental, unexpected, electric, could splice your entire existence into before and after? What if I told you that the most honest feeling you've ever experienced grew from the most dishonest foundation you've ever built? What if the person who mobbed you believed you loved again was the same person you betrayed every single day? With every word you didn't say, with every truth you hid behind a carefully constructed lie, would you believe that kind of love could survive? Would you believe you to deserve to? Yes, at the uncomfortable truth that most people want to admit. We've all lied to survive. Maybe not about who we are or what our life looks like, but we've all stretched the truth when we were desperate, when we were afraid, when telling the whole story felt like handing someone a reason to walk away. We've said fini when we were breaking. We've smiled through pain because showing each felt too vulnerable. We've presented polished versions of ourselves in job interviews, on 4 stages, in moments when being completely honest felt like inviting rejection. So before you judge the woman in this story, before you decide she asks you to map you but her choices were inexcusable, ask yourself, what would you do if you were drowning? What would you sacrifice if each meant one Modi breath, one Modi day, one Modi Shinsiak, something better than the life that was suffocating you? This is a story about Gracie Ethan. A woman who lied to get a job she desperately needed. A man who fell in love with a version of her that didn't exist. An accidental kiss that became the beginning of everything. A lie that almost destroyed 2 lives. Yet truth so painful each nearly broke them both but also became the only thing strong enough to save them. Each a story about fear and courage. About the lies we tell when we terrified of being left behind. About the brutal, beautiful process of learning that love without honesty isn't the love that you all just to people hiding from each other in the dark, hoping the light never comes. If you've ever hidden parts of yourself because you were afraid no one would love the truth, the story will find you where you are. If you've ever loved someone while carrying a secret that felt too heavy to share, you Eddie recognize yourself in these pages. If you've ever wondered whether forgiveness is possible after betrayal, whether trust can be rebuilt after each been shattered, whether 2 people can find their way back to each other after everything falls apart, stay with me. Because the story isn't just about Gracie Ethan. Each about all of us. Each about the masks we wear, the truths we hide, in the terrifying freedom that comes from finally standing naked our honesty, discovering his true worth loving. Each about the kind of courage each takes to say this is who I really am when he convinced the truth will cost you everything. In each about learning that sometimes the thing he most afraid to reveal is the only thing that can set you free. There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Moments so small they fit inside a breath, yet so powerful they rewrite the entire story of who you are. A kiss can be one of those moments. But what happens when that kiss, the one that makes your heart remember what hope feels like, is built on the very thing you're most afraid to reveal? What happens when the most beautiful truth of your life is wrapped around the ugliest lie you've ever told? Some people believe love begins with honesty, with 2 souls meeting in perfect transparency, like clear water touching clear water. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes love begins in the shadows of our survival instincts, in the quiet compromises we make when we're drowning and grasping for air. Sometimes the person who changes everything walks into your life at the exact moment you're pretending to be someone you're not. And the terrifying part, they fall in love with the version you created, not the truth you've been hiding. Everyone has lied to survive. Maybe not a big lie, maybe not a lie that builds a whole new identity, but we've all done it. We've stretched the truth on a resume. We've smiled when we wanted to scream. We've said, I'm fine, when we were breaking apart inside. We've all taken that shortcut through fear, hoping it would lead us somewhere safe. But nobody expects a lie to create love. Nobody expects that the mask you put on just to get through one day would become the face someone falls for. And when that happens, when the lie becomes the foundation of something real, the weight of it can crush you from the inside out. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a kiss that changed everything and the lie that almost destroyed 2 lives. It's a story about fear, about desperation, about the fragile line between survival and self-destruction. But it's also a story about second chances, about the courage it takes to stand naked in your truth, and about the kind of love that doesn't run when the mask finally falls. If you've ever hidden parts of yourself because you were afraid of being left behind, if you've ever loved someone while carrying a secret that felt too heavy to share, this story will find you where you are. And maybe, just maybe, it will remind you that the truth, no matter how painful, is the only thing that can set you free. Let me tell you about Ethan Miller. 30th years old, CEO of a baby product company in Portland, Oregon. The kind of man who walks into a room and doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He built his company from the ground up, brick by careful brick, turning sleepless nights and calculated risks into something solid, something respected. People who work for him say is fair but distant, warm but guarded. The kind of leader who remembers your name but never asks about your weekend. He's the man who has everything figured out on paper, but if you look closely, if you catch him in those quiet moments between meetings, you'll see it, that flicker of loneliness that successful people carry like a shadow they've learned to ignore. Ethan's life is composed, controlled, predictable. He wakes at 6, runs 4 miles along the river, answers emails before most people open their eyes. His office overlooks the city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view he barely notices anymore. He's respected in his industry, admired for his vision, consulted for his expertise. But respect isn't warmth, admiration isn't connection, and somewhere beneath that calm, polished aesthetia, there's a part of him that wonders if this is all there is, this carefully constructed empire of productivity and profession distance, this life that looks perfect from the outside but feels like an empty room echoing back his own footsteps. He doesn't talk about it, of course. Men like Ethan don't complain about loneliness when they have success. They don't admit that sometimes, in the middle of a board meeting or a business dinner, they feel like they're watching their own life from behind glass, present but not quite there, functional but not quite alive. He tells himself he's content. He tells himself that purpose is enough, that building something meaningful is its own reward. And most days, he almost believes it. Most days, the routine is enough to keep the questions at bay. But then, on an ordinary afternoon at an innovation expo he didn't even want to attend, everything changes. A stumble, a breath, a kiss that wasn't supposed to happen. And suddenly, the glass shatters. Now let me tell you about Grace Turner. 29 years old, drowning in debt, alone in a city that doesn't slow down for anyone, trying to survive in a world that feels like it's designed to let people like her slip through the cracks. She's the kind of woman who smiles in job interviews even when her stomach is tight with fear. Who says, "I'm great. Thanks for asking," when she's one missed payment away from losing everything. Grace is smart, sharper than most people realize. The kind of intelligence that doesn't come from degrees but from necessity, from having to learn quickly or go under. But intelligence doesn't pay rent. Talent doesn't erase the red numbers in your bank account. And in a job market that treats experience like currency and desperation like a stain, Grace has learned that sometimes you have to lie just to be seen. She didn't plan to lie. That's what she tells herself later, when the weight of it becomes unbearable. She didn't wake up that morning thinking, "Today I'm going to build a fake life." But when you're sitting across from a hiring manager who's already halfway checked out, when you see their eyes glaze over as they glance at your resume with its gaps and its temporary positions, when you realize they're looking for someone stable, someone routed, someone who won't be a risk, you make a choice. A split-second calculation, a survival instinct, dressed up as strategy. Grace said she was married. She said she had a child. She said it because she believed in that desperate moment that it would make her seem more reliable, more grounded, more worthy of a chance, and it worked. The lie opened the door that honesty had kept locked. She got hired as a temporary worker at Ethan's company. A 3-month contract doing administrative support, filing reports, organizing data, invisible work that keeps everything running but rarely gets noticed. It was supposed to be simple. Show up, do the job, collect the paycheck, disappear when the contract ends, keep your head down, don't get attached. Don't let anyone look too closely. But life has a way of unraveling even the simplest plans. Because Grace didn't account for she didn't account for the accidental kiss. And she definitely didn't account for Ethan Miller, the one person who would make her wish, more than anything, that she had told the truth from the very beginning. You know that moment when you're so overwhelmed that you take an emotional shortcut just to breathe? That moment when the weight of everything, the bills, the fear, the uncertainty, becomes so heavy that you do almost anything just to make it lighter, even for a day. That was Grace. She wasn't a liar by nature. She was a survivor, backed into a corner, making the kind of choice that feels justified in the moment but haunts you later. And now, standing on the other side of that choice, working in the same building as the man she accidentally kissed, carrying a lie that grows heavier every single day. Grace is about to learn that some shortcuts don't lead anywhere safe. Some shortcuts lead you straight into the one place you were trying to avoid: the truth. Before we dive into the turning points of this story, I want to ask you something. If this story is already stirring something inside you, a memory, a feeling, a question you've been carrying, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Not because of algorithms or numbers, but because stories like this exist to remind us that we're not alone in our messy, complicated humanity. Every person watching this has hidden something. Every person here has made a choice out of fear and wondered if it was the right one. So if you're here because you need to feel understood, stay with me. Let this story find the places in you that need to be seen. Now, let's go back to the moment that started it all. The moment when two strangers collided and everything shifted like a door opening in a room you didn't know existed. It happened at an innovation expo in downtown Portland. One of those sprawling events filled with booths and bright lights and people networking with a kind of forced enthusiasm that makes everything feel slightly performative. Ethan didn't want to be there. He'd been to 100 expos just like this one, shaking hands with the same types of people, listening to the same types of pitches. But his company was launching a new product line and appearances mattered. So he showed up in his tailored suit and his calm, professional mask, doing what he always did, being present without really being there. Grace was there too, but for entirely different reasons. Her supervisor had asked her to help set up the company booth, and she'd said yes, because that's what temporary workers do. They say yes, they stay useful, they don't make waves. She was moving through the crowd with a stack of brochures when it happened. A photographer, one of those aggressive event photographers who gets too close and doesn't take no for an answer, lunged toward her, trying to get a candid shot. Grace turned sharply to avoid him, stumbled on the uneven flooring, and collided directly into someone solid, warm, unexpected. Her hands flew up instinctively to catch herself. And in that collision of momentum and panic and surprise, her lips brushed against his. It wasn't a real kiss, not intentional, not planned. It was an accident, a half-second of contact that should have meant nothing, just two strangers bumping into each other in a crowded space, a moment to laugh off and forget. But something about it didn't feel like nothing. Maybe it was the way time seemed to pause, just for a breath. Maybe it was the way their eyes met immediately after, wide and startled, like they'd both felt the same electric jolt. Maybe it was the way neither of them moved for a fraction too long, caught in the strange intimacy of an accidental touch that somehow felt more honest than anything either of them had experienced in months. It was like tripping on a loose wire and accidentally setting off the alarm of your own life. Suddenly, everything is loud, everything is awake, and you can't pretend you didn't notice. Ethan stepped back first, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady her, even as his mind tried to process what had just happened. "I'm so sorry," Grace blotted out, her face flushing. her heart hammering in her chest. She expected him to be annoyed, maybe even angry. But when she looked up at him, she saw something else entirely. Surprise, yes, but also something softer. Curiosity. A flicker of warmth in eyes that had been distant just seconds before. "No, it's okay," Ethan said, and his voice was quieter than she expected, gentler. "Are you all right?" And in that question, in the genuine concern behind it, Grace felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just some corporate executive irritated by a clumsy temp worker. This was a person, a HEIR person, looking at her like she mattered. They stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the noise of the expo fading into background static. Grace should have walked away. She should have apologized again, laughed it off, disappeared back into the crowd, but she didn't. And Ethan didn't move either. There was something unspoken passing between them, something neither of them could name, but both of them felt a recognition, a pull, like two people who'd been walking alone in the dark, suddenly realizing they weren't the only ones awake. "I'm Grace," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan," he replied. And when he smiled, a small, almost shy smile that didn't match the composed CEO image at all, Grace felt her chest tighten with something dangerous, something that felt too much like hope. She didn't know yet that he was her boss. She didn't know yet that this accidental moment would become the thread that tied them together, and she definitely didn't know that the lie she'd told to survive would soon become the one thing threatening to destroy the most real connection she'd felt in years. All she knew, standing there in the chaos of the expo with the memory of an accidental kiss still tingling on her lips, was that something had started, something fragile and terrifying and undeniable, something that felt like the beginning of everything or the beginning of the end. Monday morning arrived like a reckoning Grace wasn't prepared for. She walked into the office building with her temporary ID badge clipped to her shirt, her coffee already going cold in her hand, her mind still replaying that accidental kiss from the expo like a song stuck on repeat. She told herself it didn't matter. It was a random encounter, a moment with a stranger she'd never see again. The city was full of people, full of fleeting connections that meant nothing beyond the seconds they occupied. She had work to focus on, bills to pay, a lie to maintain. She couldn't afford distractions. She couldn't afford to think about the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, or the way her name had sounded in his voice, careful and warm. But then she saw him, standing near the elevator bank, talking to someone from the marketing department, wearing a different suit, but the same calm, composed expression. Ethan Miller, her boss, the CEO of the company where she was a temporary worker, invisible and replaceable. And suddenly, the floor felt unsteady beneath her feet. Her stomach dropped. Her breath caught. Because this wasn't just a coincidence or a strange twist of fate. This was a complication she hadn't prepared for. A thread connecting to parts of her life that were supposed to stay separate. The stranger from the expo was the man whose name appeared on every company-wide email, whose decisions shaped her paycheck, whose world existed on a completely different level than hers. And she'd kissed him? Accidentally? Yes, but she'd kissed him. Their eyes met across the lobby. For a split second, she saw recognition flicker in his face, surprise, maybe confusion, and something else she couldn't quite read. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, to dissolve into the morning crowd of workers filing toward their desks. But it was too late. He was already walking toward her, his expression shifting into something professional but not cold, guarded but not unkind. "Grace," he said, and the way he remembered her name sent a small, dangerous thrill through her chest. "I didn't realize you worked here." His voice was calm, measured, but there was a question underneath it, an unspoken curiosity. She forced a smile, the kind of smile she'd perfected over years of pretending everything was fine. "Small world," she said lightly, hoping her voice didn't betray the panic rising in her throat. And just like that, the lie she'd told in a desperate job interview became something heavier, something more complicated. Because now, it wasn't just a story on paper. Now it was a wall between her and the one person who'd made her feel seen in a very long time. It's like painting a wall the wrong color and adding more layers just so you don't have to admit the mistake. That's what Grace's life became in the weeks that followed, layer after layer of small, even careful omissions, strategic silences. She'd told the hiring manager she was married with a child. And now that fiction lived in her employee file, in casual conversations with coworkers, in the assumptions people made when they saw her checking her phone or leaving exactly at 5. "Gotta pick up my kid," she'd say with a practiced smile, and people would nod knowingly, sympathetically, never questioning it because why would they? Nobody lies about having a family. Nobody invents a whole life just to seem more stable, more diably, more worthy of being kept around. But maintaining a lie is exhausting in ways people don't talk about. It's not just the big moments, the direct questions you have to dodge, or the stories you have to keep straight. It's the small things, the constant low-level vigilance, the mental load of remembering what you've said and to whom, of making sure your fake life doesn't contradict itself. Grace found herself inventing details she didn't need to invent: her husband's job, her daughter's age, the name of the school she supposedly attended. She kept a photo on her desk she'd found online, a stock image of a smiling child that could be anyone, and when people asked about her, Grace would smile and say something vague and loving, feeling the lie coat her tongue like ash. Every word felt like another brick in a wall she didn't know how to tear down. And the worst part, the part that kept her awake at night, staring at her ceiling in the small apartment she could barely afford: Ethan. Because Ethan wasn't distant anymore. He wasn't the untouchable CEO who existed only in company newsletters and executive meetings. He started finding reasons to stop by her desk. Small reasons, professional reasons, a question about a report, a request for data, a casual check-in about a project, but there was something beneath the professionalism. Something warm and genuine that made every interaction feel less like work and more like connection. He asked how she was doing. He noticed when she looked tired. He brought her coffee once, offhand and casual, saying he'd ordered an extra by mistake, even though they both knew he hadn't. "I once created a better version of myself in a moment of fear. A version I thought people would like more than the truth. And I remember the exact moment I realized I couldn't undo it, when someone I cared about looked at that fake version with real affection, real trust, real openness." It's a trap that closes slowly, so slowly you don't notice until you're already inside it. You think you can manage it, control it, keep the truth and the lie in separate boxers, but they bleed into each other. And eventually, you're not sure which version is real anymore, the person you actually are, or the person you've been pretending to be for so long that the mask has started to fuse with your skin. Grace felt it happening. Every conversation with Ethan pulled her deeper into the trap. He opened up to her in small ways, mentioned his long hours, his occasional loneliness, the way success sometimes felt like a beautiful cage. And she wanted to be honest with him, wanted to say, "I understand. I feel that too." But how could she? She'd built a wall of lies between them, and every day it grew taller. She couldn't tell him about her real struggles, her real fears, because those belonged to a person who didn't exist in his world. The single woman drowning in debt, the temporary worker with no safety net, the woman who'd lied to get her foot in the door. That woman was invisible. The woman he was getting to know, married, stable, grounded, she was the fiction. And the more he trusted that fiction, the more Grace realized she was falling into something she couldn't control. Something real was growing between them, fed by honesty on his side and deception on hers. And she had no idea how to stop it without losing everything. There's a specific kind of torture in being seen by someone you're lying to, not the distant, surface-level seeing that happens in passing, the polite acknowledgement, professional courtesy, but real seeing, the kind where someone notices the small things about you, the things you don't even notice about yourself. The way you tap your pen when you're thinking. The way your voice changes when you're uncomfortable. The way you hold your coffee cup with both hands like you're trying to absorb its warmth. Ethan saw Grace that way, and with every small observation, every gentle question, every moment of genuine attention, the space between them grew smaller and the weight of her lie grew heavier. It started so subtly that Grace almost didn't notice it happening. Ethan would linger at her desk a few seconds longer than necessary after dropping off a file. He'd ask her opinion on things that had nothing to do with work, what she thought about a news article, whether she'd seen a particular documentary, if she liked the rain or found it depressing. Small questions, the kind people ask when they're trying to know someone beyond their job title and professional function. And Grace, despite every warning bell ringing in her mind, found herself answering honestly. Not about the big things, not about the lie that stood between them like a locked door, but about everything else. Her thoughts, her feelings, the small truths that lived in the margins of her fabricated life. She told him she loved old bookstores, the kind that smelled like paper and time, where you could lose yourself for hours in aisles that felt like portals to other worlds. She told him she believed that rain was cleansing, not depressing, that it washed away the noise and left everything quieter, softer, more honest. She told him she thought people were afraid of silence because silence forced them to hear their own thoughts, and most people spent their whole lives running from what they might discover if they stopped moving long enough to listen. And when she spoke, Ethan listened in a way that felt rare, almost sacred, not waiting for his turn to talk, not mentally composing his response, but actually absorbing her words like they mattered, like she mattered. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It was the kind of attention that makes you feel more alive and more vulnerable at the same time. And then Ethan started opening up too. Not in grand confessions or dramatic revelations, but in quiet moments that felt like gifts. Small pieces of himself he didn't show too many people. He told her about the pressure of running a company that people depended on, the weight of making decisions that affected livelihoods and families. He admitted that success felt lonelier than he'd expected, that the higher he climbed, the fewer people he could talk to without wondering if they wanted something from him. He confessed that sometimes, in the middle of a meeting or a business dinner, he felt like he was playing a role, the confident CEO, the visionary leader, and he wasn't sure anymore where the role ended and the real person began. Grace's chest tightened when he said that, because she understood it in a way that cut too close to her own truth. She wanted to reach across the desk, take his hand, tell him, "I know exactly what you mean. I'm doing the same thing. I've been playing a role too, and I don't know how to stop." But she couldn't, because her role wasn't just professional polish or emotional armor. It was a fundamental lie about who she was. So instead, she said the only thing she could say without exposing herself. I think a lot of people feel that way, like they're performing a version of themselves that other people need them to be. And Ethan looked at her with something that felt like recognition, like relief. Like he'd finally found someone who understood the particular loneliness of being seen but not known. Have you ever liked someone while hiding the worst part of yourself? It's like trying to hug someone while holding a box you don't want them to see. You can't fully embrace them because your arms are occupied protecting a secret. You can't lean into the connection because you're too busy maintaining distance. And the closer they try to get, the tighter you hold that box, until your arms ache and your heart breaks from the effort of loving someone from behind a wall you built yourself. That's where Grace lived now, in the suffocating space between wanting and hiding, between truth and survival, between the person she was and the person she'd claimed to be. She started to notice things about Ethan that had nothing to do with his position or his polish. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was tired, the way his voice softened when he talked about the parents who used his products, the trust they placed in his company to keep their children safe, the way he looked at her, sometimes, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out, curious, confused, captivated. She noticed that he smiled more when she was around, that he found excuses to walk past her desk even when he didn't need anything, that he remembered small details from their conversations days later. And every time she noticed, her guilt multiplied. Because this wasn't one-sided anymore. This wasn't just her developing feelings she shouldn't have. This was mutual. This was HEIR. Or, at least, it was real for him. The trust between them grew like something organic, inevitable, blooming in the small spaces between their work and their words. Ethan started asking her to stay late to help with projects that went beyond her job description. Not because he needed her skills specifically, but because he wanted her perspective, her thoughts, her presence. He valued her opinion in a way that made her feel intelligent and capable, not just temporary and replaceable. He treated her like an equal, like someone whose ideas mattered, whose insights were worth considering. And Grace, who'd spent so long feeling invisible and disposable, absorbed that validation like someone who'd been starving, finally tasting food. But with every moment of connection came a corresponding wave of guilt, because Ethan was opening his life to her based on a version of her that didn't exist. He mentioned her family, sometimes in passing, with genuine warmth, asking how her daughter was doing, if her husband was supportive of her long hours. And every time he did, Grace felt something inside her fracture a little more. She'd smile and deflect, offer vague, pleasant responses that didn't invite further questions, but inside, she was drowning, because the more real this became, the more impossible it felt to undo. How do you tell someone you care about that the foundation of your entire relationship is a lie? How do you confess that the person they're falling for doesn't actually exist? Grace developed real feelings for Ethan, not the shallow kind born from proximity or convenience, but something deeper, something that made her chest ache when he smiled, something that made her want to be better, braver, more honest. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to strip away the lie and stand before him naked in her truth, hoping he'd see her for who she really was and choose her anyway. But fear is a powerful thing. Fear told her he'd never forgive her. Fear told her she'd lose not just him, but her job, her income, her fragile stability. Fear reminded her that people like her didn't get second chances, that mistakes were permanent and consequences were harsh. So she held the lie close. Even as it poisoned everything beautiful growing between them, she held it tight like a person clinging to a lifeline that's actually an anchor pulling them under. And every day, she sank a little deeper. Lying is like trying to hold water in your hands. Every day, more drops slip away. At first, you think you can manage it. Cup your palms tighter, move more carefully, stay vigilant. But water doesn't cooperate with desperation. It finds the cracks. It seeps through the smallest openings. And no matter how still you try to stay, no matter how much control you think you have, eventually your hands are empty and the ground beneath you is wet with evidence you can't deny. Grace felt that slippage every single day. Small moments that should have been nothing but felt like everything, tiny fractures in the story she'd built. Hairline cracks that threatened to split wide open if anyone looked too closely. It started with the co-workers. Jennifer from accounting, who always seemed too observant, too curious, too willing to linger by the coffee machine, asking questions that felt friendly but landed like interrogations. "So, where does your daughter go to school?" she asked one morning, her tone light and conversational, but her eyes watching Grace a little too carefully. Grace's mind scrambled. She'd mentioned a school name once, weeks ago, plucked from a conversation she'd overheard. "Riverside Elementary," she said, keeping her voice steady, her smile practiced. Jennifer nodded slowly. "Oh, interesting. My sister's kids go there." "What grade is she in?" And Grace felt her throat tighten because she'd never assigned a specific grade, never built out that detail. And now she had to invent it on the spot, had to make it match whatever age she'd vaguely implied before. "Third," she said, hoping it sounded natural. Jennifer smiled. "Maybe they know each other." "What's her name?" And Grace felt the water slipping through her fingers, felt the lie expanding beyond her control, sprouting new branches she couldn't track. "Emma," she said, pulling a name from nowhere, watching Jennifer's face for signs of suspicion or belief. These moments accumulated like debts she couldn't pay. Mark from MAID mentioned seeing her at a grocery store on a Saturday. Alone, no child in sight, no ring on her finger, "Day off from the family?" he asked casually. And Grace laughed it off, said her husband had taken their daughter to the park, that she'd needed an hour to herself. But she saw the flicker of something in his expression, not accusation, not yet, but curiosity, the kind that makes people start watching more closely. Sarah from HR asked for updated emergency contact information, and Grace had to invent a phone number, a name, an address, where her fictional husband could supposedly be reached. She wrote it down with a steady hand, knowing that if anyone ever tried to call that number, the lie would collapse instantly. But what choice did she have? Admitting the truth now would be worse than maintaining the fiction. Or at least, that's what she told herself, even as the weight of it pressed harder against her chest. The paperwork nearly exposed everything. It was a routine audit. Nothing unusual, HR reviewing employee files to ensure compliance with company policies, checking that all documentation was complete and accurate. Grace didn't think anything of it until she received an email asking her to verify her marital status and dependent information for tax purposes. Her heart stopped. She stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, trying to understand what this meant, what they were asking for, what would happen if she couldn't provide proof. Marriage certificate. Birth certificate for standard documentation that every employee with a family would have. Standard documentation that Grace couldn't produce because none of it existed. She felt panic rise like water in her lungs. For 3 days, she avoided HR, sent vague emails saying she'd need to locate the documents, that they were in storage, that she'd have them soon. She barely slept. She couldn't eat. Every time her phone buzzed with a work email, her stomach twisted, expecting the message that would end everything. The confrontation, the accusation, the termination. She considered running, just quitting, disappearing, starting over somewhere else under a different set of lies, but she couldn't, because leaving meant losing Ethan, and she'd already fallen too far to walk away without breaking, then, by some miracle, she didn't deserve. The audit shifted focus. Budget cuts. Someone explained. They were streamlining the review process, only checking files for senior employees and recent hires. Grace had been there just long enough to fall into a gray area, not new enough to warrant immediate scrutiny, not senior enough to be prioritized. She was invisible again, but this time, invisibility felt like salvation. The email thread went quiet. The request was dropped, and Grace exhaled for the first time in days, knowing she dodged something catastrophic, but also knowing it was only a matter of time before the next crack appeared. The next question she couldn't answer, the next drop of water slipping through her desperately clenched hands. But the closest call, the moment that nearly shattered everything, came from Ethan himself. They were working late one evening, the office mostly empty. The city lights glowing through the windows like distant stars. It was one of those comfortable silences they'd learned to share, both focused on their work but aware of each other's presence in a way that felt intimate without being intrusive. Grace was reviewing a report when Ethan spoke, his voice casual but curious. "How old is your daughter?" he asked, glancing up from his laptop. Grace's fingers froze on her keyboard. Her mind went blank. She'd said, "Third grade 2 Jennifer," which would make her 8 or 9. But had she ever mentioned an age directly to Ethan? Had she been consistent? 8, she said, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. She just turned 8 last month. Ethan smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made her chest ache. "That's a good age," he said, "still young enough to think you're magic, old enough to have real conversations." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, became more thoughtful, more vulnerable. "Do you ever bring her by the office? I'd love to meet her sometime. We have that daycare partnership program for employees' kids during school breaks. Emma would probably love it." And Grace felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Because this wasn't a casual question anymore. This was an invitation. This was Ethan trying to integrate a family into his world, trying to connect the pieces of her life he thought existed. This was him caring enough to want to know the people she loved, to make space for them in the small world they'd been building together. She wanted to scream, she wanted to cry, she wanted to confess everything right there, to let the truth spill out even if it destroyed her. But instead, she smiled. She said, "That's so thoughtful. Thank you." She's pretty shy around new people, but maybe someday. And she watched Ethan's face light up with warmth, with the kind of genuine kindness that made her feel like the worst person alive. Because he believed her. He trusted her. He was falling for a woman who didn't exist, and every moment she let it continue was another betrayal she couldn't take back. That night, Grace sat in her empty apartment and cried in a way she hadn't cried in years deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal and true. She cried for the lie she couldn't escape. She cried for the connection she was poisoning. She cried for Ethan, who deserved honesty and was getting deception wrapped in smiles and she cried for herself, for the woman she'd become, someone so afraid of being left behind that she'd rather live in a cage of her own making than risk standing in the open air of truth. The water was slipping through her fingers faster now, and Grace knew, with a certainty that felt like mourning, that she couldn't hold it much longer. The question wasn't if the lie would collapse. The question was when, and who'd be left standing when it did. There are moments in life that split time in half, the person you were before and the person you become after. Moments so sudden and absolute that they don't fade into memory. They crystallize. They become the sharp edge you cut yourself on over and over, reliving it in the middle of the night. In the shower, in those quiet seconds before sleep when your mind won't let you rest. For Grace and Ethan, that moment arrived on a Thursday afternoon in November when the rain was hammering against the windows and the office felt smaller than usual. The air heavy with something neither of them could name, yet but both of them could feel. Ethan had been in back-to-back meetings all morning, the kind that drain you of everything but leave you with nothing to show for it. He'd returned to his office around 3, loosening his tie, rubbing his temples, trying to reset before the next round of obligations. His assistant had left a stack of messages on his desk, calls to return, emails flagged as urgent, the usual avalanche of demands that came with his position. He was halfway through them when his phone rang. The temp agency, routine call, he assumed. They checked in periodically about contract workers, making sure everything was running smoothly, asking if extensions were needed. He answered without much thought, his mind already moving to the next task. "Mr. Miller, this is Sandra from Apex Staffing. I'm calling to follow up on Grace Turner's placement. Her 3-month contract is coming to an end next week, and we wanted to discuss renewal options." Ethan leaned back in his chair, a small smile crossing his face. "Yes, absolutely. Grace has been excellent. I'd like to extend her contract, possibly discuss transitioning her to a permanent position." There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind of pause that feels like a breath held too long. "That's wonderful to hear. We'll start the paperwork. Just to confirm for our records you're satisfied with her performance despite the initial discrepancy in her application." Ethan's smile faded. "Discrepancy," he repeated, his voice careful, his attention sharpening. "What discrepancy?" Another pause. Longer this time, the sound of papers shuffling. "Oh, I assumed you were aware." When Ms. Turner replied, she indicated on her initial screening form that she was married with a dependent child, but when we processed her tax documents, there was no spouse or dependent listed. We flagged it internally, but assumed it was a clerical error or perhaps a recent separation. Has she not mentioned? But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. The words were still coming through the phone, but they sounded distant, distorted, like he was underwater, married with a child, no spouse listed. Discrepancy. Lie. The pieces clicked together with a sickening clarity that made his chest tighten and his hands go cold. Every conversation, every mention of her daughter, her husband, her family, every time he'd asked about them, genuinely cared about them, made space for them in his thoughts. None of it was real. He ended the call. He didn't remember what he said. if he said anything at all. He just ended it and sat there in the silence of his office, staring at nothing, feeling something crack open inside him that he didn't have words for yet. It wasn't just anger, though anger was there, sharp and hot beneath the surface. It wasn't just betrayal, though that was there too, cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. It was something worse. It was the disorienting, destabilizing realization that the person he'd been falling for didn't exist. That every moment of connection, every conversation that had felt real and rare and worth protecting, all of it had been built on a foundation of fiction, and he'd been too blind, too willing, too desperate for connection to see it. He didn't storm down to her desk. He didn't make a scene. That wasn't who Ethan was. He was controlled, composed, the kind of man who processed emotions privately before acting on them. But inside, he was burning. Inside, he felt like someone had reached into his chest and rearranged everything, left him hollow and wrong and unable to recognize the landscape of his own feelings. He finished his workday because that's what he did. He finished what he started, honored his commitments, maintained the appearance of normalcy even when everything inside him was chaos. But when 5 o'clock came, when the office started emptying and the sky outside darkened into early winter night, he walked to Grace's desk, and the look on his face when she turned to greet him, she knew. Immediately, she knew. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Not angry, not loud, just quiet, in a way that felt worse than yelling. "My office." Now, Grace's blood turned to ice. Her hands trembled as she saved her work, stood up, followed him down the hallway that suddenly felt endless. She could feel eyes on her coworkers glancing up, sensing something wrong, curious but not intervening. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and erratic, drowning out every other sound. When they reached his office and he closed the door behind them, the silence was so complete it felt like suffocation. Ethan didn't sit. He stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stood there, looking out at the rain, at the city blurred by water and glass, gathering himself in a way that made Grace's stomach twist with dread. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but underneath it she could hear the fracture lines, the barely contained devastation. "Is there a husband?" he asked. Grace's throat closed. "No," she whispered. "Is there a child?" "No." Silence. Long, brutal, suffocating silence. Then Ethan turned to face her, and the look in his eyes broke something inside her that she knew would never fully heal. It wasn't fury. It wasn't hatred. It was worse. It was disappointment. It was hurt. It was the look of someone who'd believed in something beautiful and just watched it disintegrate. "Why?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the word, just slightly, just enough to let her see how much this was costing him. "Why would you lie about something like that?" Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced them back, forced herself to stay present, to face what she'd done. "I needed the job," she said, and her voice sounded weak, even to her own ears. I thought if they believed I was stable, grounded, that I had a family depending on me, they'd be more likely to hire me. I was desperate. You didn't think I'd care." Ethan interrupted, and now there was an edge to his voice, a sharpness she'd never heard before. "You didn't think it would matter. Grace, I asked about your daughter. Multiple times. I cared about her. I made plans to meet her. I trusted you. It felt like watching your own castle collapse. Knowing you placed the first crooked stone." Grace stood there in the wreckage of everything she'd built, everything she'd destroyed, and there were no words that could fix it. No explanation that could make it hurt less. No apology that could undo the fact that she'd lied to him over and over, every single day. Even as he opened his heart to her, even as he trusted her with pieces of himself he didn't show to anyone else. "I wanted to tell you," she said, and it sounded pathetic, hollow. "So many times. I wanted to, but you didn't," Ethan said, cutting her off. "You had dozens of chances." Hundreds. Every time I asked about your family, every time we talked, every moment we shared, you chose the lie. You chose to keep lying to me." He turned away from her again, his hands gripping the edge of his desk like he needed something solid to hold on to. "Did any of it mean anything to you?" he asked. And his voice was so quiet now, so broken, that Grace felt her own heart shatter. The conversations, the connection, the ... everything. Was any of it real? Or was I just another part of the performance? "It was real," Grace said, and now the tears came, hot and unbidden, streaming down her face. "Everything I felt was real. Everything I told you about myself, except the lie, it was all real. I know you have no reason to believe me, but it's the truth. I care about you." "I don't," Ethan said sharply, holding up a hand. "Don't say it. Whatever you're about to say, don't. Because I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know if I ever did." The silence that followed felt like death. Grace wanted to reach for him, to explain, to beg for a chance to make it right. But she could see it in his face, in the way he wouldn't look at her. In the rigid set of his shoulders, she'd crossed a line that couldn't be she'd broken something that couldn't be repaired. "I think you should go," Ethan said finally, his voice flat, emptied of emotion. "Your contract ends next week. I'll make sure you're paid through the end of it. But I don't want you here anymore. I can't look at you and not see the lie. So please, just go." Grace stood there for one more second, memorizing his profile, the line of his jaw, the way the rainlight fell across his face. She wanted to say she was sorry. She wanted to say she loved him. She wanted to say 1,000 things that might matter, or might just make it worse. But in the end, she said nothing. She just turned and walked out of his office, out of the building, into the rain that soaked through her clothes in seconds. And as she walked, she felt the weight of what she'd lost. Not just Ethan, not just the job, but the version of herself she'd been becoming in his presence. The woman who felt seen, valued, worthy, that woman was gone now. And Grace was left alone with the truth she'd been hiding, wondering if honesty, when it finally arrives, is supposed to hurt this much, wondering if some stones, once placed crooked, can ever be straightened, or if you just have to live in the ruins of what you built and learn to call it home. There's a specific kind of emptiness that comes after loss, not the dramatic, theatrical kind that announces itself with grand gestures and visible collapse, but the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your bones like cold and makes every normal action feel strange and performative. You wake up, you go through the motions, you answer when people speak to you, but somewhere deep inside, you're absent, hollowed out, going through life like someone operating machinery you no longer understand the purpose of. That's where Ethan lived in the weeks after Grace left. In the quiet, relentless emptiness of a life that looked exactly the same on the outside but felt fundamentally altered on the inside. He threw himself into work the way drowning people grab at anything floating. Meetings stretched longer. Projects multiplied. He stayed at the office until the cleaning crew arrived, until the city outside his windows shifted from evening to night to the pale gray of early morning. His assistant started leaving concerned notes on his desk, reminders to eat, suggestions to take a day off, gentle hints that he was pushing too hard. But Ethan couldn't stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. And remembering meant feeling the full weight of what he'd lost, what he'd believed in, what had turned out to be smoke and mirrors and desperate survival dressed up his connection. He told himself he was angry. Anger was easier, cleaner, more manageable than the truth. He replayed their conversations in his mind, searching for signs he'd missed, clues he should have caught, moments where the lie had shown its edges. He felt foolish for trusting her, naive for believing that someone could genuinely care about him without ulterior motives. He built walls in his mind, fortified them with logic and self-protection and the cold comfort of cynicism. But late at night, when exhaustion finally pulled him under, the walls crumbled, and what lived beneath the anger was something far more painful: heartbreak. The simple, devastating truth that he'd fallen in love with someone who didn't exist, and he didn't know how to mourn a person who was never real. But the strangest part, the part that kept him awake more than anything else, was that she had felt real. The conversations, the laughter, the way she'd looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, all of it had felt genuine. He couldn't reconcile the Grace who'd lied with the Grace who'd understood his loneliness, who'd listened without judgment, who'd made him feel less alone for the first time in years. Were both versions true? Could someone be both the liar and the person who made him believe in connection again? Or had he just been so desperate for intimacy that he'd projected depth onto someone who was simply good at performing it? The company ran smoothly without her. That was the practical truth that made the emotional truth harder to accept. Work continued. Projects were completed. The temporary position was filled by someone efficient and unremarkable who did exactly what was asked and nothing more. Everything functioned. Everything moved forward. But Ethan noticed her absence in ways that had nothing to do with productivity. The coffee cup that sat on his desk in the mornings. He'd ordered it himself now, and it tasted wrong, too bitter or too weak, never quite right. The hallway past her old desk that he avoided without consciously deciding to. The moments in meetings when he'd start to formulate a thought and realize he wanted her perspective. Wanted to hear what she'd say before remembering she wasn't there anymore and wouldn't be again. Grace, meanwhile, was disappearing in a different way. She'd returned to the world she'd been trying to escape, the world of debt and uncertainty and jobs that barely paid enough to survive. She worked retail for a while, standing behind counters smiling at customers who didn't see her, who looked through her like she was part of the fixtures. She worked reception at a dental office where the fluorescent lights buzzed constantly and made her head ache. She applied for dozens of positions, her resume honest now, stripped of the lie that had briefly opened doors. But honesty didn't pay better. Honesty didn't make her more employable. It just made her invisible again. She thought about Ethan constantly, not in a wistful, romanticized way, but in the raw, unfiltered way you think about mistakes you can't undo. She replayed their last conversation. His voice, the look on his face, the way he'd asked if any of it had been real. She wanted to call him, to write him, to find some way to make him understand that she'd never meant to hurt him, that the feelings had been genuine, even if the foundation was false. But what would that accomplish? It would be selfish, self-serving, a way to ease her own guilt without considering what he needed. So she stayed silent. She carried her regret alone, let it reshape her from the inside out, taught herself to live with the knowledge that she'd destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her because she'd been too afraid to trust it with the truth. Months passed. Winter settled over Portland, gray and wet and relentless. Grace found a small apartment she could almost afford, worked 2 part-time jobs to cover rent, learned to live on less sleep and smaller dreams. She stopped checking the company's website, stopped torturing herself with updates about Ethan's professional life. She focused on survival, on getting through each day, on rebuilding a life that felt honest, even if it felt hollow. And slowly, incrementally, she began to forgive herself, not in a grand, redemptive way, but in small acknowledgments. She'd made a terrible choice out of desperation. She'd hurt someone she cared about. She couldn't change it, but she could learn from it. She could choose differently going forward. That had to be enough. Then, in early March, when the rain had finally started to ease and the first hints of spring were appearing in the trees, something shifted. The company faced a crisis, a technical malfunction in their flagship product line, a design flaw that had somehow made it through multiple rounds of testing and was now causing failures in the field. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it could be. Parents were complaining. Reviews were tanking. The media was starting to pay attention, and Ethan, for all his leadership and vision and resources, couldn't figure out what was wrong. His team ran diagnostics, brought in consultants, worked around the clock trying to identify the problem, but the answer remained elusive, hidden somewhere in thousands of lines of code and design specifications and manufacturing protocols. Sometimes the person who hurt you is also the one who knows how to fix what broke. Grace heard about the crisis through a former coworker she'd stayed in touch with, someone who mentioned it in passing during a coffee catch-up, and the moment she heard the description of the malfunction, something clicked in her mind. She knew what was wrong. Not because she was smarter than Ethan's team, but because she'd worked on a similar issue at a previous job, had seen this exact failure pattern before, knew the specific sequence of events that caused it and the relatively simple fix that prevented it. She had the solution, but using it meant reaching out to Ethan. It meant walking back into the wreckage she'd created and offering help when she had no right to expect he'd even listen. For 3 days, she did nothing. She told herself it wasn't her problem anymore, that she'd forfeited any right to be involved the moment she'd lied. But the thought wouldn't leave her alone. What if the company failed because she stayed silent? What if her pride, her shame, her fear of rejection caused real harm to a business and the people who depended on it? What if Ethan lost everything he'd built because she was too cowardly to face him one more time? On the 4th day, she wrote an email. Short, professional. To the point, no apologies, no emotional appeals, just information. The problem, the solution, the technical specifics he could verify with his team. She signed it with her name and hit send before she could change her mind. Then she waited, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, telling herself she'd done the right thing regardless of what came next. Ethan saw the email, 2 in the morning, when he was still at the office. Exhausted and frustrated and running out of options. He stared at her name in his inbox for a long time before opening it, and when he read what she'd written, when he forwarded it to his technical team and watched them confirm that she was right, that this was the answer they'd been searching for, he felt something complicated twist in his chest. Relief, gratitude, confusion, and underneath it all, something he'd been trying to suppress for months, the undeniable truth that he missed her. Not the version he'd thought she was, but her. The real person beneath the lie. The woman who'd understood his loneliness, who'd made him laugh, who'd seen him as more than his position or his success. The woman who, even now, even after everything, had reached out to help him when she had nothing to gain from it. He needed her professionally. Yes, but also in ways that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with the empty space she'd left behind. The question was whether needing someone was enough, whether trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, whether two people who'd hurt each other could find their way back to something real, something honest, something worth the risk of trying again. Ethan didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time since that brutal afternoon in November, he allowed himself to consider the possibility, and in his quiet office, surrounded by the evidence of her insight and her care, he picked up his phone and typed a single message. "Thank you. Can we talk?" Grace stared at the message for so long that the screen dimmed and went dark. 3 words, 17 characters. A question that felt like standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain, knowing that one step forward could either save you or send you falling. "Can we talk?" She read it again, and again, searching for tone in the flatness of text, trying to discern whether this was professional courtesy or something more, whether he wanted to thank her formally or whether there was still a door open somewhere in the ruins of what they'd been to each other. Her hands shook as she typed her response. "Yes. Whenever it works for you." She hit send before she could overthink it, before fear could convince her to say no, to protect herself from more pain, to leave well enough alone, because it wasn't well enough. It had never been well enough. She'd been carrying the weight of what she'd lost for months, and the chance to speak to him again. Even if it was just to hear him tell her officially that they were done, it was worth the risk. It had to be. They met 2 days later at a coffee shop neither of them had been to before, neutral territory that held no memories. Grace arrived early, sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and watched the door like someone waiting for a verdict. When Ethan walked in, her breath caught. He looked different. Thinner maybe, or maybe just tired, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he also looked like himself, like the man she'd fallen for, And seeing him again after months of absence felt like touching something you'd thought was lost forever and discovering it still had weight, still had substance, still existed outside your memory. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan walked toward her, his movements careful, controlled, like someone approaching something fragile or dangerous. Not quite sure which. He sat down across from her, and the silence that followed was thick, heavy with everything unsaid. Grace wanted to speak first, to apologize, to explain, to fill the space with words that might ease the tension. But before she could, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet and measured. "Thank you for the solution. You saved the company. Probably saved my career." Grace shook her head slightly. "You would have figured it out eventually." "Maybe," Ethan said, his eyes on his coffee cup. Not on her, but maybe not in time. "You didn't have to reach out after everything. You could have stayed away. Why didn't you?" Grace chose her words carefully, knowing that honesty was all she had left to offer. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because I've already caused enough damage. And because... ... double quotes. She paused, her voice catching. "Because I still care what happens to you, even if I have no right to..." Ethan looked up at her then, and the expression in his eyes was complicated pain and softness, anger, and something that looked almost like hope. "I was so angry at you," he said quietly. "For months, I was furious. I felt betrayed and foolish, and like I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. I kept replaying everything, looking for the signs I missed, hating myself for being blind." He stopped, took a breath. "But I couldn't hate you. Not even when I tried. And that made it worse somehow." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced them back, forced herself to stay present. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was raw, stripped of pretense. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know sorry is just a word, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I lied to get the job because I was desperate. And then it spiraled beyond my control. Every time I wanted to tell you the truth, I was too afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of losing everything. But I lost it all anyway because I was too much of a coward to trust you with the truth when it mattered." "You should have told me," Ethan said, and there was no accusation in his tone, just exhaustion. "At any point, you could have told me. I would have been angry. Yes. Hurt, definitely, but I would have understood. People make mistakes out of desperation. I get that. What I couldn't understand was the continued deception, day after day, even when we were getting closer. That's what broke me, Gracia. Not the original lie, but the choice to keep lying when you knew I was falling for you." "I know," Grace whispered, "and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I'll regret not trusting you enough to believe you might forgive me. I'll regret every moment I chose fear over honesty. But for what it's worth, everything else was real. Every conversation, every feeling, every moment we shared, those weren't lies. I know you have no reason to believe me, but it's the truth." She looked at him directly now, letting him see the raw truth in her eyes. "I fell in love with you, Ethan, and that was the most honest thing I've ever felt." The silence that followed felt different. Softer somehow, like something between them was beginning to shift, to settle, to find new ground. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she remembered from late nights at the office when he was thinking through something complicated. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "I don't know how to move past what happened. How to trust again. How to separate the person you were pretending to be from the person you actually are." He looked at her, and his eyes were honest, vulnerable. "But I can't pretend I don't feel something. I can't pretend seeing you again didn't make me realize how much I've missed you. Not the fabricated version. You. The person who understood my loneliness. The person who made me laugh. The person who cared enough to help me even after I pushed you away." Grace felt something flutter in her chest. Not hope exactly, but its quieter cousin, possibility. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said softly. I don't expect this to go back to what we were. But if you're willing, I'd like to try being honest with you. Completely honest about who I am, where I came from, why I made the choices I made. No more walls, no more protection, just truth. Even if it's ugly or uncomfortable or not what you want to hear. She paused, searching his face. You deserve that. You always did. Ethan was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee cup in small circles on the table, thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful but not closed. The company needs someone to manage the product recall and redesign process. It's temporary, but it's complex. It requires someone who understands the technical side and can communicate with manufacturers. You're the most qualified person I know for it. He looked at her directly. I'm offering you a contract position. Short-term, professional. We'd be working together, but there would be clear boundaries. No expectations beyond the work. Just a chance to see if we can be in the same space without it destroying both of us. Grace understood what he was really saying. This wasn't about the job. This was a test, a carefully constructed opportunity to rebuild trust in the only safe way he could offer through work. Through professional collaboration, through proximity that had guardrails. It was his way of saying, I'm not ready to forgive you, but I'm willing to try not hating you. I'm willing to see if there's anything left worth salvaging. And Grace knew, with a clarity that felt like relief, that this was more than she deserved and exactly what she needed. I'll take it, she said, and I promise you no lies, no half-truths. If you ask me something and I can't answer, I'll tell you I can't answer, and why, but I won't lie to you again. Ever, Ethan nodded slowly, and something in his expression softened just slightly. Okay, he said, we start Monday, 9 a.m., and Grace. She looked at him, waiting. I can't promise this will turn into anything beyond professional. I can't promise I'll be able to get past what happened, but I'm willing to try. That's all I can offer right now. Grace felt tears finally spill over, but she smiled through them. That's more than I thought I'd get. Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve. They sat there for a while longer, not saying much, just existing in the same space without the weight of secrets between them. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy, but it was honest. And honesty, Grace was learning, was its own kind of hope. When they finally left the coffee shop, walking out into the gray afternoon light, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, exactly. Not absolution, but something close to peace. The kind that comes from finally standing in your truth, no matter how painful, and discovering that it doesn't destroy you, that sometimes the truth is the only thing strong enough to hold the weight of what comes next. Working together again was strange in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Not bad, exactly, but unfamiliar, like learning to walk in a body that had been broken and reset. Testing weight on bones that remembered pain but were trying to remember strength too. They were careful with each other at first, almost excessively so. Conversations stayed professional, confined to project updates and technical specifications. They met in conference rooms with doors open, never alone for too long, never straying into territory that felt too personal or too reminiscent of what they'd been before. Grace arrived early and left on time. Ethan was cordial but distant, polite but guarded. They worked side by side like two people who'd agreed to a truce but hadn't yet figured out how to build peace. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It started with small things. A shared frustration over a manufacturer's incompetence that made them both laugh. The first real laugh they'd shared since everything fell apart. A moment when Grace caught a mistake in a report before it went out, and Ethan looked at her with genuine gratitude instead of wariness. A late afternoon when they were both exhausted, and Ethan brought her coffee without being asked, remembered how she took it, and she looked up at him with surprise and something softer. Something that looked like the beginning of trust rebuilding itself one small gesture at a time. Grace kept her promise when Ethan asked questions about her background, her previous jobs, her life before the lie. she answered honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. She told him about the debt, about being raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't always keep the lights on, about learning early that the world didn't reward honesty as much as it rewarded appearances. She told him about the shame of being poor in a world that treats poverty like a moral failing, about the desperation that comes from applying to dozens of jobs and hearing nothing back, about the moment she decided to lie because she couldn't survive another rejection. And Ethan listened. Really listened, not to judge, not to excuse, but to understand. And in understanding, something in him softened. He started opening up to, not in grand confessions, but in small admissions. He told her about the loneliness of success, about how the higher he climbed, the more isolated he felt, surrounded by people who wanted things from him but rarely saw him. He admitted that the months after she left had been some of the hardest of his life, not because of the professional complications, but because he'd realized how much he'd come to depend on her presence, her perspective, her way of making him feel less alone. He confessed that he'd been terrified to reach out to her again, afraid that seeing her would reopen wounds that were barely beginning to heal, but also afraid that not seeing her meant living in a half-life where he was functional but not fully alive. They worked long hours on the recall project, and somewhere in the intensity of it, the pressure, the shared purpose, the late nights when exhaustion stripped away pretense, they began to remember why they'd connected in the first place. Grace's intelligence wasn't just theoretical. She was brilliant under pressure, creative in solving problems, able to see angles that others missed. And Ethan wasn't just a distant executive. He was thoughtful, principled, willing to admit when he was wrong, fiercely protective of the people who worked for him. They balanced each other in ways that felt natural, necessary, like 2 parts of a mechanism that only worked when both were present. But the real turning point came during a board meeting in late April. The recall had been successful, the redesign was underway, and Ethan was presenting the resolution to the board of directors, explaining what had gone wrong, how it had been fixed, what measures were being implemented to prevent future failures. Grace wasn't supposed to be there. Her contract role didn't require board-level presentations, but Ethan had asked her to attend, to be available in case technical questions arose that he couldn't answer. So she sat in the back of the conference room, trying to be invisible, trying not to feel the weight of eyes on her, some curious, some suspicious, all wondering who she was and why she was there. The presentation was going well until one of the board members, an older man with a reputation for being aggressive and unforgiving, interrupted. "I have a question about the personnel involved in this crisis," he said, his voice sharp. "I've reviewed the timeline, and it appears that the initial design flaw occurred during a period when we were using temporary contract workers in key roles. Is that correct?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. The flaw wasn't caused by any individual. It was a systemic oversight that made it through multiple levels of review. The board member wasn't satisfied, but the temporary worker who identified the solution, Ms. Turner, she was previously employed here under false pretenses, wasn't she? Lied on her application about her family status. The room went silent. Grace felt her face flush, felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, to be anywhere but there. But before she could speak, before she could attempt to defend herself, Ethan stepped forward. His voice was firm, clear, carrying an authority that made even the aggressive board member pause. Yes, Grace made a mistake when she applied. She misrepresented her personal situation because she was desperate for employment. It was wrong, and she's acknowledged that. But what matters more is what she did after. She worked with integrity, solved problems others couldn't, and when the company faced a crisis, she reached out to help when she had no obligation to do so and nothing to gain from it. The board member started to interrupt, but Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength. "I made mistakes too. I failed to create an environment where someone felt they could be honest about their circumstances without fear of being dismissed. I failed to see that our hiring practices might be excluding talented people based on factors that have nothing to do with their ability to do the job. So if we're assigning blame for what went wrong, I'll take my share. But Grace Turner is one of the most capable people I've worked with. And if you're suggesting we let her go because of a lie she told out of desperation months ago, then you're making a serious mistake. The silence that followed was different now, not hostile but stunned. Grace stared at Ethan, her heart hammering, tears burning behind her eyes, but refusing to fall. He was defending her, not just politely acknowledging her contribution, but actually standing up for her, putting his own reputation on the line, taking responsibility for his part in creating the circumstances that led to her lie. It was the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever done for her. It was courage and grace and a kind of forgiveness that didn't require words because it lived in action. Another board member spoke, an older woman with kind eyes. "What are you proposing, Ethan?" Ethan looked directly at Grace when he answered, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "I'm proposing we offer Miss Turner a permanent position as Senior Technical Advisor. She's earned it, not because I feel guilty about what happened, but because she's genuinely the best person for the role. And if the board has concerns about her past, I'll address them. But I won't let this company lose someone valuable because we're too rigid to forgive human mistakes made under desperate circumstances." The board deliberated briefly. Some were skeptical. Some were pragmatic. But ultimately, they trusted Ethan's judgment, and the motion passed. Grace was offered the position real employment, with benefits and security, and a title that reflected her actual skills rather than her fabricated credentials. When the meeting ended and the room emptied, Grace and Ethan were left alone. She looked at him, overwhelmed, searching for words adequate to what he'd just done. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why would you put yourself on the line like that? For me?" Ethan stepped closer, his expression open in a way it hadn't been since before everything fell apart. "Because you deserved it. Because you've been honest with me for months now, and I've watched you work harder than anyone else to prove yourself. Because I realized something these past weeks." He paused, his voice softening. "I realized that I can't hate you, not even when I try. And I don't want to anymore. I want to trust you again. I want to believe that people can make terrible mistakes and still be worth believing in. I want ... He stopped, took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to try again. For real this time. No lies, no walls, no pretending we don't feel what we feel." Grace felt something break open inside her chest. Something that had been locked and frozen for so long she'd forgotten what warmth felt like. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "After everything I put you through, are you sure you can forgive me?" Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand. His touch was gentle, careful, real. "I can't promise it'll be easy," he said. "Trust takes time to rebuild. But I also can't pretend you're not the person I think about first thing in the morning and last thing at night. I can't pretend that working with you these past weeks hasn't reminded me why I fell for you in the first place. So, yes, I'm sure if you're willing to be patient with me while I learn to trust again, I'm willing to try." Grace squeezed his hand, tears finally falling freely now. But they were different tears. Not shame or regret, but relief and hope and the overwhelming gratitude of being seen in your full, flawed humanity and chosen anyway. "I'll wait as long as it takes," she said. "I'll earn your trust back however I can. I promise you I'll spend every day proving that I'm worth this second chance." Ethan smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him in months. And it was like watching sunrise after endless darkness. "You already have?" he said. And when he pulled her into an embrace, tentative at first, then stronger, more certain, Grace felt something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt Rome. Some lightning doesn't burn. It illuminates the path. And standing there in the empty conference room, wrapped in the arms of a man who'd chosen to see her truth instead of her mistakes, Grace understood that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about deciding that the future mattered more. It was about believing that people could grow, change, become better versions of themselves through the painful process of being honest. And it was about having the courage to love someone not despite their flaws, but because of the strength it took for them to stand in their truth and ask for a second chance. They had that courage now. Both of them, and whatever came next, they would face it together, honestly, imperfectly, but finally free. Everyone tells you that honesty is the foundation of love, that real connection is built on truth, transparency, vulnerability, laid bare, like an open book waiting to be read. They tell you that lies destroy everything, that deception is the poison that kills relationships before they even begin. And they're right. Mostly. But here's what nobody tells you. Sometimes the most beautiful love of your life starts with the ugliest lie you've ever told. Sometimes the person who changes everything walks into your world at the exact moment you're pretending to be someone you're not. And sometimes the truth that sets you free is the same truth that threatens to destroy you. What if I told you that a single kiss, accidental, unexpected, electric, could split your entire existence into before and after? What if I told you that the most honest feeling you've ever experienced grew from the most dishonest foundation you've ever built? What if the person who made you believe in love again was the same person you betrayed every single day? With every word you didn't say, with every truth you hid behind a carefully constructed lie. Would you believe that kind of love could survive? Would you believe it deserved to? Here's the uncomfortable truth that most people won't admit. We've all lied to survive. Maybe not about who we are or what our life looks like, but we've all stretched the truth when we were desperate, when we were afraid. When telling the whole story felt like handing someone a reason to walk away, we've said, "I'm fine," when we were breaking. We've smiled through pain because showing it felt too vulnerable. We've presented polished versions of ourselves in job interviews, on first dates, in moments when being completely honest felt like inviting rejection. So before you judge the woman in this story, before you decide she's irredeemable or that her choices were inexcusable, ask yourself, what would you do if you were drowning? What would you sacrifice if it meant one more breath, one more day, one more chance at something better than the life that was suffocating you? This is a story about Grace and Ethan, a woman who lied to get a job she desperately needed, a man who fell in love with a version of her that didn't exist, an accidental kiss that became the beginning of everything, a lie that almost destroyed 2 lives, and a truth so painful it nearly broke them both, but also became the only thing strong enough to save them. It's a story about fear and courage, about the lies we tell when we're terrified of being left behind, and about the brutal, beautiful process of learning that love without honesty isn't love at all. It's just 2 people hiding from each other in the dark, hoping the light never comes. If you've ever hidden parts of yourself because you were afraid no one would love the truth, this story will find you where you are. If you've ever loved someone while carrying a secret that felt too heavy to share, you'll recognize yourself in these pages. If you've ever wondered whether forgiveness is possible after betrayal, whether trust can be rebuilt after it's been shattered, whether 2 people can find their way back to each other after everything falls apart, stay with me. Because this story isn't just about Grace and Ethan. It's about all of us. It's about the masks we wear, the truths we hide, and the terrifying freedom that comes from finally standing naked in our honesty and discovering we're still worth loving. It's about the kind of courage it takes to say, "This is who I really am," when you're convinced the truth will cost you everything. And it's about learning that sometimes the thing you're most afraid to reveal is the only thing that can set you free.